Shana Tova. It's good to have you back again. I think yesterday went about as well as we could have hoped as far as using our technology and being here together as one community. Again, it's very strange and it's not what we want or what we're looking forward to. I begin this morning's sermon with a little bit of trepidation because this topic is by far the more dangerous one for us because it's not unifying if it's done wrong. And my intent is for it to be unifying. After yesterday's embrace of law and order, I'm sure you're all waiting for the other shoe to drop, and you're not wrong. This year, there has been a loud call of shofar in our country, blowing for justice. Those words should not scare you. Those words are exactly what we just did for the last 5 minutes. So as a Jew, whatever the political winds of the day are, when you hear somebody call for justice, your ears should perk up and not your defensive response. Can you hear the shofar call? Can you hear the voice of the shofar? Prophecy works this way. It interrupts the powerful, the normal. It condemns the complacent, and it demands attention. Quite frankly, prophecy is rude. It's uncomfortable. It's often unwelcome. People usually don't like prophets, and things don't usually go well for them, historically. And that is, of course, why we need them. So if you are already uncomfortable with the topic that I have chosen, and I haven't said anything other than that yet, then I encourage you to hear the voice of the shofar, knowing that being challenged is part of being loved. Today I will talk about the core belief that the protests this year articulated, that there is systemic racism in the criminal justice system. Yes, I understand that the issue of racial justice and race inequality is much bigger than the criminal justice system. And as I said yesterday, law enforcement is often a reflection, a mirror of society. It's not what creates things. It's not really where the underlying problems lie. But that is what the spark was, and that's the fire that we're trying to take care of right now. And besides, if you want me to address everything that has to do with racial justice, I'm not sure how long you want the sermon to be. Again, like yesterday, there's a basic moral and religious content here which Judaism speaks to. How can we not? Judaism, both our religion and our history, condemns racism. The only legitimate Jewish argument is whether or not the racism being spoken of is real. And since we know that racism has been a constant component of this country's history since its founding, the question really isn't, is there racism? The question is, how bad is it? And it is that basic belief about the nature of racism in this country that has become the dividing point for so many this year, and I know, in this synagogue. My hope is to unite us in both Jewish beliefs and a context of social science, research, and fact, not opinion and not politics. It is not my goal to set the political agenda for you or to tell you how to vote or what exactly you should change about America. People with strong progressive beliefs will probably feel at the end of this sermon that I have not gone far enough. People with strong conservative beliefs will probably wish that I had picked a different topic. But if I can bring us together on some basic Jewish beliefs and point out scientifically proven facts and problems, then I will have done my job for today because we can have those in common as you continue to engage moving forward. Yesterday I talked about law and order. But what happens when law and order goes wrong? After all, over the course of Jewish history, we have certainly learned that not every government is worthy of our prayers, and not every police action is noble in character. God knows that our people knows better than any other. 100 years ago, law and order meant violently breaking up union strikes. 200 years ago, it meant enforcing the largest institution of slavery that Western history had seen. And when George Floyd was murdered, every police officer I know said they were disgusted and they condemned the officer who did it. But saying it was just a few bad cops every time avoids the difficult topic. Each example might be explained away, but the big picture must be understood. Something has changed in American awareness on this topic. When upper middle class moms and dads lie down on Main Street in South Orange and chant about racism, something new is happening. Every pulpit in America this year will be talking about racial justice in one way or another. We have been talking about it, you and I, here at B'nai Shalom for years. Let's remember the other sermons that I have given recently so that we all understand that my teachings this morning are part of a sustained effort to teach Torah on this topic from this pulpit over time. I'm not blowing with the wind, and this message is not about the election. I'm again talking about the single most important evil in our society, the evil of racism. To review, on the first day of Rosh Hashana 5 years ago, I gave a sermon entitled, Black Lives Matter. On the first day of Rosh Hashana 3 years ago, I gave a sermon entitled, White Supremacism. On the second day of Rosh Hashana 3 years ago, I gave a sermon on law and criminals. In 2015, I spoke about the deaths of Trayvon Martin in Florida, of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and of Eric Gardner here in New York. I spoke of Freddie Gray from Baltimore. I said their names. I acknowledged who they were. And at the time, I raised the question in these exact words. I asked you, is there institutional bias in policing against black people in America? End quote. And I pointed out that saying the words Black Lives Matter is a sentence that everyone should be able to agree with. Now, the leadership of that group come back, and I do not endorse the movement or those leaders when I affirm the simple truth of the grammatically correct sentence, Black lives do matter. It is astounding that people can't say that sentence without immediately saying some kind of but, to undermine it. So we have been struggling with this, you and I, as a theme of Rosh Hashanah for years, and yet somehow this year is different. This year is worse. This year is more active. And this year, real change may actually begin. What I want to do this morning, therefore, is understand the Torah view, which I've taught so many times before, very quickly, and then especially the facts that the social science research has documented on the issue to demonstrate what I'm talking about. I have certainly been educated this year, and I am on a path to greater understanding and to greater empathy. And every year when I pray to God, no matter what the topic of the day, that's what I ask for, greater understanding and greater empathy. I hope that you will be there as well, because those values, seeing the image of God in all people, human equality, mutual understanding, and empathy, are essential to the religion that says over and over again, because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. In addition to my previous messages on race in America, I also gave a sermon 2 years ago about listening to the other side of the argument. You may recall I told you to switch cable TV news programs. Many of you did this, and boy, did I hear about it. And many of you did not. And I challenge you, go back and do that. It is annoying, it is infuriating, but it is essential if you want to bridge the gaps between us in this deeply divided country. It is the stone statue of idolatry in Judaism that has ears that cannot hear, eyes that cannot see, and a mouth that cannot speak. So too the prophets condemn the people who are like them. And today we need ears that hear and eyes that see. When we talk about systemic racism in America, we're talking about listening to another person's story. I don't need to like it, and I may not draw the same conclusions politically about society as they do, but I do need to hear it. I need to listen to it. I need to value it. And when I do, I am not destroying the lessons of America, although I am filling them out. Like all good exercises in writing history over time, it is about getting a more three-dimensional picture of what has actually happened in the past. So I better understand what is happening in the present, and I have more empathy for the people whose experience of history is different than my own. If we value learning, which Judaism does, we need to accept that our myths may not be literally true. Like dinosaur bones force us to reconsider the past, so too the historian may force us to reconsider America's past. Doesn't undermine it, doesn't make it bad. It's just more of the truth. First, we absolutely must admit that the average black person's experience of race in America is profoundly different than the average white person's experience of race in America. How could it not be? Profoundly. And in community gatherings this year on campus at Drury University, where I work, in conversation with clergy around town and nationally, and just in the narratives that we have heard this year through the voice of protest, it is abundantly clear many in Black America have no reason for nostalgia when it comes to American history and the average Black person's experience of and attitudes towards policing and criminal justice. Their typical experience of policing and criminal justice is very different from the average white person's experience. And until we all understand why, we will never fully fulfill the highest ideals of our country, equality and freedom. This is where it begins. So I'll share an experience I had. A few years ago, I went to the Governor's Ball Musical Festival. And while there, a particular musician had several thousand people packed together, jumping up and down, enthralled by the performance. Me, being an old guy with academic tendencies, I couldn't really hear or understand the lyrics that were flying out of his mouth, but the kids loved it. It was very cool, even if I was not. And then came the refrain, with every mouth shouting in unison over and over, and I won't say the word, F the police, F the police, F the police, F the police. Naive and out of touch with his views, his voice, his experience, my jaw dropped in horror. After all, Judaism, as we saw yesterday, believes in law and order and sees law enforcement as an essential part of a just society. I saw anger, indoctrination, and incitement. I was very disturbed. I recall that moment this year during the protests, and I looked up the rest of the lyrics of the song for the first time. They were about traffic stops, racial profiling, stop and frisk, false arrests, biased courts, and prison. They were about the anger of the innocent. And yes, they also included fantasies and threats of violence against the police. They were, in some sense, a voice of prophecy, so similar to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel in our own texts, threatening the face of unjust power with destruction. And all I could hear was that refrain that shocked me to the core. And it took a real effort to hear the message it was based on. Perhaps your experience was similar to mine. Even though I was raised in a very liberal and political home, where advocacy for migrant workers was a Sunday family outing, I was taught, quite frankly, a white view of this country's history, to the exclusion of blacks in particular, and the group experiences of most minorities in general. I was taught to draw the Mayflower, bringing pilgrims to the land of freedom. I knew that there were 200 years of slave gallows who brought over 300,000 people in chains under the whip with no hope for freedom, that they grew in numbers, but their children were owned, as were their children's children, in a system of evil chattel bondage. But I never considered it to be part of my story of America. Not really. I was told of the brave pioneers of the Old West and President James Polk's manifest destiny. And while I was taught of that, I was taught also of the despoiling and destruction of native peoples, but it was safely distant, a sad but irrelevant, ultimately, lesson of what America was, but not what it is. I was taught that Christopher Columbus was a great explorer who might even have Jewish background we could all be proud of. And only in the past year, when a statue was removed from the valley section of West Orange, did I really dive below the surface as history uncovered the violations, enslavement, and murder that was done at his command. And I played cowboys and Indians as a kid, which always meant cap guns and playing at killing at some point. When I was young, I learned of the equality that defined the human rights of the U.S. Constitution. And I was not troubled that women and blacks were not included from the beginning, or that blacks were 3/5 of a person for the math. We are over that now, I was taught. That is part of what makes America so great. So why dwell on it? I was educated that when we fought the Civil War, we fought it to end slavery, and that President Lincoln achieved that completely with the Emancipation Proclamation. But I never really understood how Reconstruction after the war had failed, how equality was never granted, and how in some places chain gangs replaced slavery, and why Jim Crow held on for another 100 years after the Civil War was over. It's not that I didn't know those things, and more, but they weren't really the story. They weren't the point. They were some marginal side story that didn't reflect the real lessons that I was being taught about the greatness and the exceptionalism that is America. Don't get me wrong. I believe America is great. I believe America is exceptional. And in every generation, we have been in the context of the world. But now the voices of protests are demanding that I reconsider those blind spots, not only in my knowledge of the past, but in my conclusions about the past. America is exceptional, worthy of every patriotic pride that I hold. But that doesn't mean it was perfect or even always good. We have national sins in our history, and racism is a persistent one. Earlier this summer, someone asked me, how many black teachers did you ever have? Think about it. Again, this was an uncomfortable truth to learn about myself. Never realized. I attended 3 elementary schools, 2 junior high schools, high school, 4 different universities. I hold 2 bachelor's degrees, 3 masters. I speak 4 languages. I've lived on 4 continents. It's not like I've been hiding in a hole. In all that time, I have had a total of 24 years old, and never again since. I had black classmates, friends, colleagues, but in a cringeworthy admission, I recognized that my liberal parents never had black people over for dinner, and we had no black friends in the house in my childhood. We had black house and nannies. I was never taught the narrative experience of black America from a black American. I never was pointed to a black person and told, hey, that's someone you can learn from. That's someone you should try to be like. Perhaps, like me, you were never exposed to that other experience of America and American history in a personal way. How can I possibly understand what we were being told about systemic racism if I never experienced it? And so just like my nudnik side telling you to watch the other cable station, I realized that I have to really listen to the narrative that I'm being told. I may decide it will or won't define my politics. That's up to me. But I cannot put my head in the sand, lock up my ears, and refuse to hear the experience and narrative of 20% of the country and still claim to be smart, educated, or well-informed. Maybe that's part of the problem. Racism to a lot of people means overt hate and prejudice. Racist people are those who use the N-word, or its Yiddish equivalent, the Shin word, and think blacks are somehow less than whites or Jews or whoever because they are black. That is not what the words mean. The words systemic racism means the system, not the people in it, has racially biased outcomes, regardless of anyone's intent. When one accuses the criminal justice system of systemic racism, it does not mean that all cops are racist, or district attorneys, or judges, or prison guards. It means that a black person in the system is more likely to have a negative outcome, all other things being equal, than a white person. In science, that is called a hypothesis. Only a closed-minded or a biased person rejects or accepts a scientific hypothesis without weighing the evidence. The claim is measurable and can be proven true or false. Objectively, it has been proven true to me, and I'll share why. Now, why am I going into this on a Rosh Hashanah sermon, these facts I'm about to put out there? Because our religion, and conservative Judaism in particular, has always said that when you are proven a true fact, you reinterpret your Torah or your worldview accordingly. I mentioned dinosaurs, the 7 days of creation, the idea of a global flood. We know, scientifically proven to our intellect, these things did not occur in that way. We are forced, as Maimonides told us to in the Guide of the Perplexed, to use our reason and reinterpret them and understand them without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We keep the Torah sacred and are grateful that science helps us understand it better. If we have standing, entrenched views of society that need to be challenged, it is the intellect and the fact set that will tell us that we have to do that. So I went looking for facts to dispel the noise of cable television. The following facts are peer-reviewed social science studies that account for other discrepancies and differences, such as location, such as gender, etc. When all other factors are removed, the following facts are true. A massive study published in Nature, May 2020, 95 million traffic stops by 56 police agencies over a 7-year period, found that while black people were much more likely to be pulled over than whites, the disparity decreases at night when police are less able to distinguish the race of the driver. The study also found that blacks are more likely to be searched after a stop. The whites were more likely to be found in a search with illegal drugs. The darker the sky, the less pronounced the disparity between black and white motorist stops. A 2020 report on 1.8 million police stops by 8 huge law enforcement agencies found that blacks are stopped at a rate 2.5 times higher than the per capita rate of whites. The report also found that black people were far more likely to be stopped for reasonable suspicion as opposed to actually being seen breaking a law. They're 3 times more likely than any group to be searched, and even though the searches of white people were more likely to turn up contraband, they're more likely to be stopped and searched. And other studies confirm that nationwide, while whites and blacks are roughly pulled over equally for traffic violations, stops of blacks for other reasons or no reason are double or triple the rate of white motorists. Once stopped, they're subjected to police search more often. Black driver is more likely to be pulled over and then more likely to be searched. It's measurable. It's systemic bias. Doesn't mean the individual officer is a racist, but there is a negative outcome that is measured nationwide significantly. So the joke about driving while black is no joke. Now, once in contact with the police, the likelihood of arrest is also higher. A national study on misdemeanor arrests published in 2018 by the Brown University Law Review found that black arrest rate is at least twice as high as white arrest rate for disorderly conduct, drug possession, simple assault, theft, vagrancy, and vandalism. The black arrest rate for prostitution is almost 10 times higher. All other things being equal. And the numbers for violent interaction with the police and escalation are also higher for blacks. In the much debated topic of black deaths at the hands of police, the study shows that if you adjust for age and remove suicidal adults, which people who argue against this don't do, young, unarmed, non-suicidal male victims of police fatal use of force are 13 times more likely to be black than white. In particular, black people are consistently arrested, charged, and convicted of drug crimes, including possession, distribution, and conspiracy at far higher rates than white people, all things being equal. This despite research showing that both races use and sell drugs at the same rate. And given the 3 strikes and you're out crime bills that ballooned the American prison population in the last 30 years to insane numbers, this systemic difference in racial outcomes was transferred directly and exaggerated in the prison population. A 2019 review of academic literature by the Prison Policy Initiative found that in large urban areas, black felony defendants are over 10% more likely than white defendants to be held pre-trial with no bail when charged with similar crimes. Nationally, the review found that young black men are 50% more likely to be detained pre-trial than white defendants, and on average were given bail amounts that were twice as high. Blacks receive plea deals or reduced sentences in the judicial system once they do arrive at court. And a 2013 study found that after adjusting for numerous other variables, federal prosecutors were almost twice as likely to bring charges carrying mandatory minimums against black defendants as against white defendants accused of similar crimes. According to figures from the National Registry of Exonerations, black people are 5 times more likely to go to prison for drug possession than white people, and according to exoneration data, black people are also 12 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of drug crimes. Black people comprise 12% of the drug users in the country, 29% of arrests for drug crimes, and 33% of the people in prison for drug crimes. And once there, the sentences are more severe as well. According to a 2012 study, black defendants who kill white victims are 7 times as likely to receive the death penalty as black defendants who kill black victims. Moreover, black defendants who kill white victims are more than 3 times as likely to be sentenced to death as are white defendants who kill white victims. According to a 2018 study by Pew, 1 in 23 black adults in the United States is on parole or probation versus 1 in 81 white adults. While blacks make up 13% of the U.S. population, they make up 30% of those on probation and parole. A 2018 survey found that 63% of blacks have had a family member incarcerated versus 42% of whites. While black youths make up 14% of the youth population, a 2018 study found that they make up 53% of minors transferred to adult court for offenses against persons tried as adults, despite the fact that white and black youths make up nearly an equal percentage of youth charged with such offenses. Blacks are more likely to be suspended from school, all things considered, and the pipeline to prison thus begins. And prison has other consequences. By removing an adult from the family, family structures and communities are gutted, and prison record has a lasting consequence. According to a 2016 study, 1 in 13 African Americans of voting age has lost their vote, a rate more than 4 times greater than that of non-African Americans. Over 7% of the adult African American population is disenfranchised from voting compared to 1.8% of the non-African American population. So if imprisonment is systematically off, then the removal of voting rights is also systemically off. And so the science has spoken. I apologize for the long tirade of numbers that didn't include a single Torah quote. But the Torah value here is we can be convinced by facts and science no matter what we want to believe and no matter who is telling us things and what we think of the people who are telling us those things. And so science has spoken. Statistically, all things being equal, blacks do not have the same engagement with law enforcement. They are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, held without bail, tried as adults, convicted, sentenced more severely, and are less likely to be let out on parole. And yes, they are more likely, all things being equal, to die in the hands of law enforcement. So the essential critique of the Black Lives Matter slogan is actually objectively correct. The prophets of old did not have social science to back up their critique of power or their calls for justice. Justice, justice, you shall seek, it says. Speak truth to power, it says. Hold the king accountable, it says. Heed the voice of prophecy, it says. Champion the cause of the widow and the orphan and stranger, it says. For you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And for that reason, I have brought you out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Hear the voice of prophecy in our streets and respond. Let the bell of liberty ring throughout the land. And when you think of these issues, think of the call of the shofar. Racial justice is a Jewish value. Now, you'll have a different opinion on some of the numbers that I've given you. I recognize that. Please don't debate me. I don't want to do that. that would be a waste of our time, because that won't change the big picture, which says that outcomes are different if you're black. That's essentially true. And inasmuch as lives are ruined by those unequal outcomes, it is important to assert that Black lives matter, as we assert that racial justice is a Jewish value. So when you think of these issues, make it personal. Don't say, that's a bad cop. Look at the victim and say, that was a good kid. Think of Elijah McClain in Aurora, Colorado. Teenager with a ski mask, walking home, listening to music, and dancing. Someone called the police, thought he was strange, said, I don't know if he's good, I don't know if he's bad, but he's weird. And the police rolled up on him. And then him, putting a chokehold on him, paramedics were called. They administered a ketamine shot to tranquilize him, and he died of a heart attack. Why? There's no answer you can give that is sufficient. And if the numbers say the outcomes are unequal, then the testimonies of individuals need to be understood not as always being an outlier or an exception, but can't you admit at least some of them are simply because the system has a systemic outcome that is biased. There is no reason that's good enough. Things must change. I leave it in your hands how to decide who the person is to lead us in that direction. But the truth of the complaint is proven, and our core beliefs about God, Torah, and the ideal use of power in society that I spoke about yesterday, those things demand that we not turn away or rationalize as if the problem does not exist. Can you hear the call of the shofar? Can you listen to the voices of the other, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you, and no matter how much you disagree with their conclusions about the country or the values, or whether it's whatever? If we can't listen to each other, we're already doomed. Because it is the statue that has eyes that see not, but a heart that is dedicated to God's hope for all of us. In the image of God, and in the pursuit of justice, in a dedication to what the Torah tells us we should believe, that things can, should, must be better values, which surely we all share. Have a sweet New Year. Shana Tova.